Okay, this is how do I say this? An interesting class. We covered most of the history, as we all know. We started from the very beginning, and Lisa, I'll allow you to continue managing the waiting rooms. And basically, our 11 classes finished to the beginning of the construction of the Second Temple. We're not going through the era of the Second Temple, the next 400 plus years, and then its destruction by the Romans. We're just going to jump into Judaism as we know it today. And Judaism as we know it today basically was formulated over the course, as we know of, since the times of Moses at Mount Sinai. There was many things that happened with the Jewish people during the times of the judges over those 300 years, give or take. And we spoke about different mitzvot like Yichud, like Deborah, who met people outdoors, not indoors. Think of pre-COVID times, because she didn't want to be in solitude with another man. Talk about the, being ahead of the curve with the hashtag Me Too movement. And we spoke about King David, King Solomon bringing certain traditions. If you remember, we spoke about needing to wash hands before the bread was a new enactment by the kings. This was not in the Bible. We spoke about Daniel, who lived in the times of the exile. We spoke about not drinking wine from non-Jews. So not everything that we do or we don't do today in Judaism started during the times of the Bible, during the times of when the Jews were in Mount Sinai. And so the question becomes so how did we formulate, how do we know what's what today? What do we take? What is correct? What is really the difference between the 613 commandments to today, us celebrating Rosh Hashanah in a backyard tent at the Chai Center, or at a catering hall, or at a Writers Guild theater, or your local temple, or hiring caterers for a bar mitzvah and blowing $50,000 to $100,000. So how does a lot of these things come about today? So that's what I want to give attention to tonight. It's important to break down the initial Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, which is biblical commandments and rabbinical commandments. Biblical commandments stemming from the Bible and rabbinical commandments stemming from the rabbis, hence the word rabbinical commandments. So some examples of the biblical commandments would be eating matzah on Passover. Believe it or not, Rosh Hashanah, even though the temples today around the world, at least pre-COVID, their bread and butter was from membership, from Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So temples can actually budget and see if they're going to run a deficit that year or if they're going to have a surplus that year based on their membership. And they only know how their membership is going to be in 2022 or in 2023 based on who is buying seats and who's going to become members for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It does not say anywhere in the Bible, thou shalt be a member of the Chai Center. Does not say thou shalt be a member of Stephen S. Wise, although it's a fine synagogue. Yet synagogues around the world are basing their entire budget, for the most part, and their identity as to who they are as a temple based on this one holiday or two holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Who can tell me how many biblical commandments for this also great important holiday, Rosh Hashanah? You can unmute yourself. How many biblical commandments are there on Rosh Hashanah? Go ahead, Ari.
I was about to say none.
Okay.
Well, shofar is, I think, is one.
Very good,
Blow the
Stevens.
shofar.
Chauffeur.
Very
Blow the
good.
shofar, right?
Very good. The shofar, very good, guys. Good. So the shofar is one. And it is the only biblical commandment of a positive commandment, because there's also a commandment of not to work. Thou shalt not work, and treat it like a Sabbath. But of the thou shalt, of what you should do on Rosh Hashanah, there's only one commandment, and that is the blowing of the shofar. So here you have biblical commandments like the matzah, or like we explained, the shofar, or we have other biblical commandments like observing the Sabbath, kosher. These are all biblical commandments. What are examples of a rabbinical commandment? Anyone can unmute yourself and let's shout it out. A rabbinical, which means the rabbis instituted, but it's not in the Bible. Besides the examples that I just said a few minutes ago, like not drinking wine or washing your hands before challah and things like that. Zali, you want to give me an example of a rabbinical commandment?
What does rabbinical mean?
From a commandment from the rabbis, midrabanan. It's not in the Torah, but we do it because, let's say, the Talmud said we should do it, or the rabbis said we should do it.
Like dip like challah or apples in the honey on like Shabbos, or no?
Okay, that's more of a custom, but that's fine. What are you wearing on your head right now?
Yarmulke.
A yarmulke, a kippah. A kippah is not in the Bible. It does not say thou shalt wear a kippah. But the rabbis figured, you know what? It makes us feel that there's something above us. It's to remind us that there's something above us. We should have awe and fear of God who's above us. And thus, we should wear a kippah. And many ladies wear a head covering after they're married, especially when they pray and so forth. So their type of thing. So that's a kippah. Another rabbinical commandment, I'll just give you, just shoot out a few other examples, is to pray, let's say, 3 times a day. Shachrit, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Doesn't say in the Bible, thou shalt pray 3 times a day. Another example would be, give me a minute, lighting the Hanukkah menorah. Lighting the Hanukkah menorah on Hanukkah is a rabbinical commandment. It was not in the Bible. It does not say anywhere in the Bible about the mitzvah of the Maccabees, or the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, or listening to the Megillah on the holiday of Purim. The holiday of Purim, as you know, came between the first and second temple. So obviously it's not going to be in the Bible. It's not going to be in the Bible, which came way prior to the first temple. I'll just give you one more rabbinical commandment. Another rabbinical commandment would be, give me a minute. Here I'm stumped at my own class. Another, give me a moment over here.
What about tefillin?
Tefillin is in the Bible. Tefillin is in the
that's
Bible.
what-
Lighting the Shabbat candles Friday night is a rabbinical commandment. It does not say in the Bible, thou shalt light the candles Friday night. But it does say you should keep the Shabbat, but it does not say lighting the Shabbat candles Friday night.
It says that you can't light during Shabbat, which means that anything that's going to be burning during Shabbat, you have to light before Shabbat. So in that sense, it does say to light before Shabbat.
You're saying that what? It's more compared to a biblical commandment?
I'm saying
Technical.
that by saying you can't light during Shabbat, that means anything that is going to be burning during Shabbat, that you're going to be using during Shabbat, has to be lit before. So in that sense, it is saying to light before. It's not saying to light before per se. It's just saying don't light during, which necessarily means you have to light before unless
Okay,
you're
fair
going to
enough.
be in total darkness the whole thing.
Fair enough.
What about tzitzit?
Tzitzit is in the Torah. It's in the Bible. It's in the Torah. Keeping the Shabbat is in the Torah. So here we gave a few examples of the biblical commandments and the rabbinical commandments. Another good rabbinical commandment would be all the blessings that we make before we eat any food, like that's a rabbinical commandment, that you should make a blessing and give gratitude towards God and be thankful and ask permission before you eat his bread. So we make a commandment. But it's not a prohibition from eating bread if I don't make a commandment. The Bible didn't say, thou shalt make a blessing. Thus, if a person puts on tefillin, for example, it would be a good example. If a person puts on tefillin, or if a person puts up mezuzah on their front door, which is a biblical commandment, having mezuzah on your front door is another example of a biblical commandment. What if I didn't make a blessing before I did that mitzvah? It's okay from the Bible perspective, because all the Bible wants is that I put on the tefillin or that I have a mezuzah on my front door. It was the rabbis that said, I think it's proper that we make a blessing. So we have all these blessings that we make today, including blessings before we eat an apple or a peach or a cucumber, but all those blessings are rabbinical in nature. The only blessing that is biblical, this is a good trivia to know, is after I eat bread and I make a birchat hamazon, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, that paragraph was composed by Moses. The paragraph was composed by Moses, but the Bible already said that if you eat and you're satiated, you should make a blessing. So Moses took the initiative and figured out what type of blessing that should be, and he composed that blessing.
That's where
So
the
you
tefillin comes from, isn't it? You should
Tefillin
bind
is
them-
separate. You should bind them, yeah, but that has nothing to do with eating.
Oh, okay.
Eating food is it's okay. Eating food is a separate. It's not a mitzvah to eat food, but the Bible tells us if you eat food, then you should make a blessing to say thank you, O Lord, for allowing me to live another day. And so that's the distinction between a biblical commandment and a rabbinical commandment. So we covered now biblical and rabbinical. Good so far? Now, in the biblical and the rabbinical realm, we have the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. Thou shalt is thou shalt put on tefillin. Thou shalt keep the Shabbat. Thou shalt keep kosher. Then you have thou shalt not. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Those are all in the biblical arena. And in the rabbinical arena, the commandments of rabbinical decrees, all the thou shalts we already gave a million examples of. Like we said, wearing the kippah or making blessings. Those are all rabbinicals. But then there's also the thou shalt nots. I remember once on the high holidays, my father said, how many commandments are there? And someone said, over 1 million. Because the rabbinical commandments are many. The rabbi said many things that we shouldn't do. So give me an example of a rabbinical commandment that we shouldn't do, like a rabbinical thou shalt not. Thou shalt not do, what's a thou shalt not from what the rabbis instituted? So an example would be of
To not eat chicken and milk on the
not eat chicken and milk. Very good, Zali. Because chicken is not really meat, it's a bird. But the rabbi said chicken may look like meat, so we shouldn't eat it with milk. Very good, Zali. That's a classic example, and that was a very good example. Another rabbinical of thou shalt not, let's say, would be anything that has to do with the second day of a holiday in America. Because in Israel, you only have to keep 1 day. I don't want to get too involved in that. In America, we have 2 days of a holiday. So the rabbis told us in America, on the second day of Yantiv, like the second day of Sukkot, or the second day of Simchat Torah, or the second day of Passover, you shall not work. You shall not watch Netflix. You shall not drive a car. All these things is pertaining to a rabbinical edict, not a biblical edict. Okay, so that's rabbis. Okay, so that's that. Now, just moving back slightly, where do we get this idea from where the rabbis get to jump into the fray here? Shouldn't it just be Whatever the Bible told us to do is what it is. The Bible gave us 613 commandments. The Bible never told us that we should listen to the Megillah on Purim. The Bible never told us we should have a menorah on Hanukkah. The Bible never told us about wearing a kippah on my head or lighting Shabbat candles. So what gives some Jewish people the right a few thousand years ago to tell us that we should wear a yarmulke? What if I don't want to wear a yarmulke? What if I don't want to light the Shabbat candles Friday night? Which rabbis are we talking about? Who are these rabbis? That we say, well, it's a rabbinical decree. Was it a Mendel Schwartz decree? Who are these rabbis? So this is a very good question. And believe it or not, it's a question that actually was proposed to me just 3 weeks ago by a very strong individual member of the Reconstructionist Temple here in Los Angeles, in Pacific Palisades. Very smart man. He should have a refuah shlema, speedy recovery very soon, because he asked it very honestly. This was around 3-4 weeks ago. And I realized, he's a smart guy. He's asked me good questions. He knows the scriptures of Talmud. And he says, who are these rabbis? How do you know? Maybe we shouldn't have a mechitza. The whole mechitza business is from the rabbis. I want to have synagogues with no mechitzas, and it should be called Orthodox. It should be called the Halacha synagogue. So I said, let's go out for dinner. So I went out to dinner with him and 2 of his buddies. This was literally 2 weeks ago. And we had a very nice dinner. And we addressed these very questions. And it was a very peaceful, somewhat peaceful dialogue. And the main point is that these rabbis that we say rabbinical commandments are rabbis from the times of the Talmud. The Talmud is a set of books, 63 volumes, and everything in Judaism, which is outside of the Bible, must originate from the Talmud. If it's not in the Talmud, then it's fair game. Then Mendel Schwartz and my Reconstructionist rabbi has the right to say, what's going on over here? It's not in the Talmud. And that's why, for the most part, the Talmud covers everything. It even covers the mechitza issue. And if it's not in the Talmud, then you have a right. You always have a right to question, but you really have a right to disagree if someone in Judaism starts to state, well, Judaism demands that we do X, Y, and Z. Well, I have the right to say, how do you know that? Give me a chapter and verse. Give me the volume. Where in the Talmud is this discussed? The Talmud are great rabbis that lived during the times of the Second Temple. Many of these rabbis are even leaders, like we discussed in prior classes, like Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, who were the Jewish leaders of the Jewish people in between the First and Second Temple. The rabbis of the Talmud, they even quote scriptures from the prophets that we ourselves discussed over the last 11 classes. So let's say when Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Joshua or Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud, going back 2,000 years, wants to give proof to something that he says, many times he'll say, because it says in Joshua chapter 4, verse 22, and then fill in the blank. And that gives that person a proof. So the rabbis themselves had to jockey and try to, so to speak, psychologically have dialogue and wrestle with their rabbi opponent if something's correct or not. But if you're able to bring a chapter and verse from the Bible, that was, of course, the top of the line. That was the Rolls-Royce 5-star platinum proof. If you weren't able to bring a proof from the Bible, and you were able to bring proof from the prophets like Joshua, or from Samson, or from Deborah, or from King Solomon or King David, and the Talmud has thousands of references to the books of the prophets. And that's what always troubled me. I'm sharing something personal with you. When I studied the Talmud in yeshiva, they would bring a proof from some of these books from the prophets, but I, Menlo Schwartz, never studied the prophets. So it's very difficult. Like when someone says in America, we have a law because it was passed in the Constitution on July 4th, 1776. But what if a person doesn't believe in the Constitution? Or he doesn't care about the Constitution, or he never studied the Constitution? So it's very difficult to have a discussion and bring the Constitution as a proof text when I'm disconnected from the Constitution. So that's why it was very important to me, especially as a rabbi, to study the prophets and the judges and all these great leaders like King David and King Solomon, because now it adds a little bit more flavor and gives a little bit more oomph when I study the Talmud and they're bringing proof, not just from the Bible, but also from the prophets. So that's the story with the 63 volumes of the Talmud. But many times, as we know, there's discussions and there's arguments. And then we have the more recent rabbis like Maimonides or Nachmanides. So I want to share with you today one page in related to Rosh Hashanah coming up. Let me share with you the screen right now. And this is, okay, do you see it, Zali? Do you see it, Larry and Shira, this page that I'm sharing? Okay, this is chapter 1 from the laws of Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, very good, thank you. This is the laws of Rosh Hashanah. There's a few chapters on the laws of Rosh Hashanah. This is by Maimonides. This is a text. I actually copied it right out of my book. It is a positive commandment from the Torah, which means when the Maimonides is saying that, he's basically stating it's not a rabbinical commandment, but it's a commandment from the Torah, from the Bible, to hear the sounding of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. How do I, Maimonides, know this? Because it states in Numbers, quote, "It shall be a day of sounding the ram's horn for you." So that's how we know in 2021, based on the Rambam, the Maimonides, that we have one positive commandment. Notice how he didn't just say it's a commandment, but it's a positive commandment, because there are also negative commandments, but we're not discussing the negative commandments, like not working, not cooking, or other kind of things. Actually, that's not a commandment of not to cook, or Rosh Hashanah we're allowed to cook, but let's say like not working is a perfect example. So it is a positive commandment from the Torah to hear the sounding. And how do we know it? Because it states, "It shall be a day of sounding the ram's horn for you." Fred, you have a question, fire away.
Yeah, it says ram's horn, but as we know, many different synagogues use many different animals' horns. How does that change?
Fred, very good. I'm glad you raised that. Let us continue with Maimonides, and then you'll see if your answer is going to be answered. The shofar which is sounded on both Rosh Hashanah, the shofar which is sounded both on Rosh Hashanah and for the Yovel. The Yovel is the Jubilee year, it's every 50 years. This shofar that we're supposed to blow is a bent ram's horn. So Maimonides, when he says it's a positive commandment to have the sounding of the shofar, it should be a day of sounding. Well, it should be a sounding of what? It should be a sounding, maybe it should be a flute, Fred. Maybe it should be a harmonica. How do we know when it says it shall be a day of sounding? It's a day of sounding with a ram's horn. So Maimonides says, because the shofar which is sounded on Rosh Hashanah and on the Jubilee year is a bent horn. All shofar other than that of a ram's horn is unacceptable. Let's continue, Fred, and then we'll get to it. Even though, let me start just trying to move this thing. Even though the sounding of the shofar Rosh Hashanah is not explicitly mentioned in the Torah, because all it says in the Torah in Numbers 29 is, what does it say in quotes? "It shall be a day of sounding for you." All it says is, "It shall be a day of sounding for you." Maybe it could be in harmonica. So Maimonides is addressing this phrase. So he says, even though the sounding of the shofar Rosh Hashanah is not explicitly mentioned in the Torah, maybe it could be a harmonica, but Maimonides says it was derived by our sages in the following manner. So indeed, it was the rabbis that inserted that when the positive commandment on Rosh Hashanah should be a day of sounding, the type of sounding should be a ram's horn. How do we know? How do the sages know to say this? Because Maimonides continues. Concerning the Yovel, concerning the Jubilee year, which is Leviticus 25:9 states, "You shall make a proclamation sounding the shofar." It should be a shofar, not a harmonica. So again, by the Jubilee year, it's very clear that the sounding, this proclamation is with a shofar. You shall proclaim with the shofar. So the oral tradition explains that just as the sounding required by the Torah in the Jubilee year requires a shofar, so too the sounding on Rosh Hashanah requires a shofar. So Fred, this explains, Maimonides is explaining how we're not supposed to use a harmonica or a flute, but it should be a shofar. So Fred has a good question. Why did we jump and say it's a ram's horn? Maybe it could be any type of horn. Maybe it could be a rhinoceros horn. Indeed, there are many communities today that will use any horn. It is preferable to use the ram's horn. Why a ram's horn? Why do most synagogues around the world use a ram's horn? You can use this at your table on Rosh Hashanah for a little words of Torah. The ram is the animal that was caught by Abraham and Isaac in the thicket. If you remember when Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, there was a ram that was basically the horns were caught in the thorns. So when Abraham was upset that the angel said, no, you cannot sacrifice your son Isaac. This was just a test. Abraham wanted to take a knife and just cut a little bit of blood and cut a little bit of Isaac's skin. And my angel said, no, you cannot do this. We Jewish people are not like other nations that kill and destroy to show commitment to our religion. But on the contrary, we're supposed to live. At that moment, Abraham notices in the thicket, a ram is stuck in the thorns by the horn. So this ram's horn, and then he sacrificed that animal. This ram's horn has always been a symbol, not just a pride for the Jewish people, but it always has been a symbol to show Jewish commitment. That this is to remind us of that story of Abraham and Isaac. So the ram is actually garnering compassion and sympathy from God on high, because the ram basically will always remind God, look what the first Jewish person did, Abraham, who was prepared to listen to the extent to even sacrifice his own son. So the ram is also supposed to always garner sympathy, compassion from God from on high. So that's why we want to use a ram's horn, and specifically it should be a bent ram's horn. There's some rams you can get a straight horn. This is supposed to be bent because a bent represents humility, to be humble, like someone that's hunched. I don't mean an old person that's hunched. I mean an individual that's a little bit, he doesn't walk around with his chest out like he's almighty king, or, but he's a bit more hunched. When you say hunched or bent, it always represents the idea of humility. So that's why it should be. So everyone agrees, Fred, it has to be a shofar. There is no dispute amongst any rabbis in Halacha of what the sounding should be. It's clear it should be a shofar, and it's a shofar, and most commentators say it should be a ram's horn for the reason I just explained, and in that itself it should be a bent ram's horn. And indeed, it's interesting because Maimonides actually was a Sephardic Jew, and there are many communities that will not use even the bent ram's horn. They'll use another kind of from another animal. But even they say the commentators on Maimonides, and even him that says it should be a bent ram's horn, even he would agree if you used a shofar that was not the bent ram's horn, it's still kosher. It's still okay. But no one asked me, actually, interestingly, the most glaring and obvious thing. Maimonides said very clearly, he said, it is a positive commandment to hear the Torah, a positive commandment from the Torah to hear the sounding of the shofar. And the Torah says it shall be a day of sounding. Is the commandment to listen to the shofar, or is the commandment to blow the shofar? This is in yeshiva, how we get down to the nitty-gritty here. There's a great dispute, there's a great disagreement. Many people say the commandment is to blow the shofar, because the verse that Maimonides himself quoted says it should be a day of sounding. It doesn't say it should be a day of hearing, a day of listening. It's a day of sounding. So again, so you have the Talmud, and then you have commentators like Maimonides and Nachmanides that try to come to certain conclusions. And indeed, most of the people will agree with Maimonides that it's indeed a day, even though we call it the day of sounding of the shofar, since not everyone can blow the shofar. Even if you could blow the shofar, that's not the mitzvah of the day, but it's rather to listen to the shofar, because just like by the Jubilee year, it's the king or a leader that blows the shofar in the Jubilee year, and everyone has to listen to it. So too, by Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah isn't to blow the shofar, but it's to listen to the shofar. Another thing important before we wrap this up a bit is we talked about the mitzvahs, the commandments. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which is the 10 days of repentance, it's important to make a distinction and not lump everything in one, like all the commandments or all the holidays, and there's the biblical holidays, there's the rabbinical holidays. It doesn't work this way. Even Rosh Hashanah, which has the mitzvah of shofar, and Yom Kippur, which Phyllis said is her favorite holiday, they're two very different holidays. I would like to say they're almost opposites, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Even though we have the tradition that states is all the 10 days of repentance, which makes it like it's one, even the Chai Center has one location for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a big backyard. We even have one rental company. They're keeping the tent and the chairs and the stage and the lights and the fans from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. So you would think it's one big fiesta, but it's not. They're two very distinct holidays. Rosh Hashanah is a commandment that God instituted because he so chose, because he decided that on my birthday, or the birthday of the world, it's important that Jewish people celebrate. And I want Jewish people to go to synagogue and pray, and I want Jewish people to listen to the shofar. So Rosh Hashanah is truly a birthday. It's a day of celebration. It's a day of celebration, not only that I'm still here, Mendel Schwartz, in 2022 coming up, or 5782, but it's a day of celebration that global warming has yet, thank God, did not destroy the world. The world is still here. And I'm thanking God and I'm celebrating with God that the world is still here. And I can still see the world. I can still go and travel to Venice or to Florence or to Israel or to Alaska, not to Afghanistan. Thank God America is still a good place for me. I still like Los Angeles. Even though I just voted yesterday. I'm not going to get into politics for how I voted. I don't want to lose my 501c3 status. I will say that I do like that individual's radio show that I have on podcast. Okay, I'll say no more before I get in trouble. So, thank God the world is still here. Thank God things are still ticking. So it's a celebration and a mitzvah, but it's being initiated from God's perspective. Phyllis, you said you like Kabbalah. This is a basic level of Kabbalistic approach on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So this is a mitzvah of shofar. It's nothing to do with the people. In other words, even if the human species were not created and no Jews and no non-Jews lived the world, Rosh Hashanah still needs to be commemorated. It still needs to be celebrated because the world still exists. God created the world 5,782 years ago. So this is an isolated mitzvah, regardless of what we like or what we dislike. What if I say, I don't like the world today. It's too hot. Florida, it's too humid in Orlando. I was there actually. It's terrible. But it has nothing to do with me. It's not my holiday, Rosh Hashanah. It's a mitzvah that belongs to God. He created the world. We're celebrating God's world. Naturally, the world was given to the Jewish people or to the human race. So it's a time that we introspect. It's a time that we pray. It's a time that we ask ourselves, well, what am I doing on this world? Why did God create this world 5,782 years ago? Those are all things that the Kabbalah asks us to do on this birthday. Yom Kippur is a completely different holiday. Yom Kippur is a holiday and a mitzvah that we're supposed to fast and pray. But this is a mitzvah not because of God. This is a mitzvah because we, the Jewish people, screwed up a few thousand years ago with the golden calf. And God atoned us on the 10th of Tishrei. And he tells Moses, I forgive you. And go ahead, we can bring down the second tablets. So Yom Kippur, which is Yom Kippur, a day of atonement. Why would we call it a day of atonement? God's not atoning for himself. The world is not atoning for itself. The trees and the animals didn't do anything wrong. The glaciers didn't do anything bad. But we, the Jewish people, sinned thousands of years ago. So God said to Moses, you know what? We'll have this Yom Kippur day be a day of atonement, not just for the Jewish people in the era of the golden calf, but I have a sneaky suspicion that Jewish people may sin in the future. And we'll make it that every 10th of Tishrei will be the annual day, atonement day. We can atone every single day, but this is the annual day that we're going to make a very powerful day and make it easy for Jewish people to atone for their sins. What day? Not Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is my birthday. But we'll do it on Yom Kippur, 10 days, the 10th of Tishrei, which was commemorating not just the Golden Calf Day, but it's happening now, this upcoming year on the 10th of Tishrei. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement that God, so to speak, gifted us thousands of years later from Mendel's words, because it's possible that I sinned in the last 365 days. So Rosh Hashanah is a day of celebration, and that's why we have a party. And we have apples and honey in the whole business with cake and honey cake and everything else. And you go home and you make a nice meal for your family. And Yom Kippur is I don't like to say the opposite, but it's like almost the opposite. You're not having apples and honey. There is no honey cake. There is no party with your family. It's a day of atonement. It's getting serious. So why did I bring this up? Not only because we're coming up to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but it's important not just to lump biblical commandments and rabbinical commandments. Even though there are two biblical commandments on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of hearing the shofar, which is one, and Yom Kippur is another biblical commandment to fast, let's say, to be a day of affliction. But let's not lump it in. Each commandment gets its own, gets its own Roman numeral, gets its own story, gets its own class. Same thing with the rabbinical commandments. You have rabbinical commandments like ladies lighting Shabbat candles. That's a story in itself. You have rabbinical commandments like wearing a kippah. That gets its attention. And indeed, that's why the Talmud is so long. And in addition to that, you have Maimonides and so on and so forth. We'll pretty much leave it at that. Of course, I'm staying on for anyone that wants to ask questions. But Lisa, you raise your hand. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, now would be that time, Lisa.
No, did not raise hand.
Go ahead. Oh, you did not raise your hand? Oh, I'm sorry.